All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
And welcome back to part 3 of this, I call it an orgy, Templar orgy we have today with none other than Scott Wolter. And Scott, are you ready for part 3?
I'm ready, Freddie.
Yeah, great. You've talked a lot now about the Kensington stone. We all now know that it's genuine. We have touched upon the incredible rare documents, the Journal of Sinclair and the Cremona document. I believe it's also called the Scrolls of Onteora. Onteora, okay. So that's covered, and it's such a big story that we have to get you back in the future when your new book is out, right? And go more into that.
Yeah.
You teased us. That should suffice for now. But what remains is maybe an even bigger story, namely what all the fuss is about. And I believe, again, we can go back to the Runestone as a key that unlocks these big doors into the huge Templar.
You got it.
Templar or spiritual. It's even bigger than the Templars. The Templars are just a chapter, as I understand it, in the whole saga.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's go back to the stone. I want to say that when I did some research, I saw, because some people will ask us after they listen to part 1, how do you think the stone was local and not moved?
Right.
And then I discovered there's internal evidence, because when the texts say it's on an island, didn't they discover in 1937, hydrological surveys that it indeed was an island?
No. And this brings up a really good point that I do make in my lectures when I do my long form. The word in Swedish, which I don't have it off the top of my head, actually means a rise in land. And a rise in land can be either a hill, a peninsula, or an island. So the word isn't just island. It really has. It means a rise in land. So you really have to be careful. The lesson that I say when I talk about this is you have to really be careful when you interpret one word from one language into another, because its meaning can be maybe pigeonholed into an area that isn't totally correct. And in this case, island is not correct, because the water levels, even in the 14th century coming forward, are pretty much the same as they are now. Now, you want to go back, 10,000 years, it was a different story in the post-glacial environment. But 14th century, that would not have been a hill or would not have been an island. And I know that country pretty good. I've been out to the farm numerous times over the years, probably 30 or 40 times, and I've looked at that very thing. But the point is that they're talking about this spot where the stone was found.
Yeah.
I was not technically correct.
Yeah, because in one of your shows, Vikings in Arizona or something, there it was flooded with streams and lakes back in that era.
Right.
And I read somewhere that hydrological survey in 1937 indicated that also this area was flooded with lakes and streams.
Okay.
But what you say now means that we don't even need an island, so it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It could still be there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, there's plenty of wetlands there and ponds and streams and small kettle lakes. I mean, they just dot the area and certainly near Kensington. But again, this is at the headwaters area of the divide between the Red River Hudson Bay watershed and the Red River and the Mississippi Missouri watershed to the south. So we're not really at a place where the water was that dramatically different going back a few hundred years.
Okay. Well,
but again, it's irrelevant anyway.
Yeah. But I did find relevant corroborations. For example, researchers have pointed out many old triangular holes cut into boulders along riverways, leading towards Oman's farm, right? And 14th century Norse seafarers were known to favor triangular mooring holes, weren't they?
Well, I mean, the mooring holes, I don't like to call them mooring holes. I like to call them stone holes. And the reason for that is that when you say mooring hole or mooring stone, you're implying an interpretation which might not be correct. And in this case, it's not correct.
Right.
So I prefer a more just factually descriptive term like stone holes, because in some cases, these stone holes could be used for mooring. In some cases, they could be used for surveying. They could just be simply marking routes that are part of a tradition that a certain group of people would understand where to put them and when to put them. The other thing is the depth of the holes, the angle of the holes. There's all kinds of things that they could do to convey information to those that knew what to look for.
Right. But what they can't get away from is that not far north of this, where the stone was discovered, and 27 years prior to it, an old fire steel identical to medieval Norse specimens, which you can find in Oslo University Museum, emerged from deep beneath the bank of the Red River. Right. So
that's very interesting. And there have been some other, artifacts like axes and I think there's a whetstone and a couple of other metallic objects. But one of the issues with those objects, and we have to be fair and honest about things if we want to stay credible, and that is that once a person picks it up out of their field or out of the ground, it's out of context. And unless they photo documented picking it up like people do with arrowheads these days and other things they find in the ground, like people that metal detect, you have to be honest about this whole context. And unless you can prove something came from someplace, it really gets hard to be able to use it. And and unfortunately, that's been the case with a lot of these metallic objects. Now, the runestone was seen by, over a dozen people shortly after it was discovered. The Olaf and his two sons were right there. So there is a relatively clean archaeological context for the stone, but for some of these other objects, unfortunately, there is not.
But we have the internal evidence, and that's where we're going to go now, because there is this medieval rune called the dotted R, which was not known to scholars prior to 35, which was found on the runestone. And I want you to tell us the significance of its presence, and also, if you could address the secret dating method, which I think is super important, especially if this is a land claim. You've made a big deal about this being a land claim, and people won't understand why until you explain now.
Well, okay. Well, first off, let's start with the dotted R. And I think what's really important here, a point I want to make that unfortunately kind of fizzled out because of personal reasons between myself and the two linguists that I work with very closely, Professor Henrik Williams and Richard Nielsen. And what was really fantastic about this collaboration between the three of us was it was really a collaboration of two completely different disciplines that when working together were able to find these key pieces of evidence that essentially answered all the questions on the Kensington runestone. Now, the questions that I'm talking about were generated initially by me, because one of the things I did shortly after I got started on the runestone was I generated a photo library of the entire inscription. And I took what I did was take both high angle and low angle reflected light images of every single man-made character, word separator, number, Latin letter, everything. And, I wanted to create a record so that people, if they wanted to, could study what each of these characters were, because I had heard that at one point there was some confusion as to what some of the letters were. So I thought this record would be important. But what happened is, as I started to take those photographs, I started to find strange things, other man-made marks that did not fit with what was previously known, like punch marks that were added on and adjacent to some of the carved lines, short strokes, little short lines going across the vertical stave or just to the right of the vertical stave. And they were clearly man-made. I didn't know what they were. So what I did is I put them in a separate folder and I let the experts figure it out, right? And there were a couple of really important things that came out of that. One of them was something called the word har. Now, on the split side of the stone, on line 10, or the first line on the side of the stone, is the word har, which was interpreted to mean have 10 men by the sea with our ships. The problem with har was it was considered to be a modern Swedish word. And in fact,
a Norwegian word.
Or Swedish word.
Yeah, also a Norwegian word. It's the same word.
Oh, okay. But it was a modern word. And that was a problem. And that was the number one linguistic problem with the Kensington Runestone for a century. Well, one of the things that happened is when I did my photo study, I documented the presence of two dots above the hooked X rune in the word har, H-A-R. And of course, the hooked X is being used for the letter A within the inscription. And I remember Dick came back to me when he went through that folder and he said, Scott, he said, are you sure there's two dots above this A in this word? And I said, absolutely. I said, look at them. Clearly they're man-made. And he said, well, do you know what this means? I said, no,
it means it becomes a new word.
What's that?
It means it becomes a new word.
And I said, no, I don't know what it means. He said, well, this is not har. It's hair.
Yes.
There are 10 men by the sea with our ships, and that's an old Swedish word.
And again, it's the same in Norwegian.
Oh, it is? Okay. Well, there you go. And so, I did not know anything about that. Nobody had seen those two dots previous to me, which quite frankly was a surprise because once you know they're there, you can see them. They're obvious.
But they were worn down more than the A itself?
Well, one of them is kind of riding into the hook in the dot. But there's, I did 3D imaging on all of these questionable characters, and you can see it's a separate tool mark that's deeper than the hook. So clearly it was a double punch. Now, again, I didn't know what that meant. I just documented it. And then it was interpreted. And suddenly the one, piece of linguistic evidence that they'd been beating the runestone up with for 100 years was gone. So now what do you do, right? Well, the ironic thing is this was important for another reason, because Professor Henrik Williams also agreed with Dick and said, yeah, that's not a modern Swedish word anymore. And those two wrote a paper. And essentially, Henrik Williams wrote in his portion, he said the discovery of these two dots and changing this word from a modern word to an old world suddenly means now that the runic inscription of the Kensington Runestone should be restudied. He didn't say it proved that it was medieval. He said it needs to be restudied.
Yeah, as a careful scholar, that's how he has to word it. But I mean, it's obvious that the skeptical case has vanished after this big change, because the meaning changes too, right?
Pardon me?
The meaning changes too.
Yeah, well, it does change slightly. So, but in any case, what happened to Professor Henrik Williams is when that paper was published, the president of the university at Uppsala called him into his office and he said, Professor Williams, if you have time to study the Kensington Runestone, you have time for additional administrative duties. Jesus. And he was punished for 3 years.
Oh, my God.
I remember sitting in his office when he was down in the dumps and he told me that. And, it just underscored, to me, the politics and the BS that's going on within the academic community.
In part one, the two of us dissed, but well deservingly, the problems of academia today. And this goes to underscore the fact that there is a reason why it has to be left to the likes of Hancock and Boval and you and like independent scholars has to deal with this, with the fringe themes. Why? Because the gatekeepers of the official narrative are vulnerable. They are not in a position, unless they are like Robert Schoch, where they are tenured. Right. But even tenured professors, they try to get rid of if they stray too much off.
Oh, yeah.
So
no, and I really take offense to the word fringe. I mean, it's like calling a person
a nutcase. Yeah.
It's like calling a woman a whore, or a disparaging word to dehumanize somebody to justify persecution.
Yeah, you know what? Frontier is better. You're the frontier.
Yeah, fringe to me is a negative connotation.
I agree,
and it instantly to most people means that person's not credible, and I take offense to that. I mean, especially when the people that have called me that are not credible, and I feel like I am. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? I want to go over there and I want to slap them in the face.
And, they have so many sneaky terminology that they use deliberately. They also use words like clandestine.
Clandestine, yeah.
Clandestine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's clearly intentional, and it's designed to undermine a person's credibility, and it's BS. And I'm not going to stand for it. I mean, it's not the way to have productive discourse, and it's, you got to just nip it in the bud. But in any case, so Har was really a big deal, and I can't underscore it enough. But the dotted R was another one of these strange things that was so important, and really was the silver bullet, if you will, that solved the Kensington runestone runologically. And that was this was another strange dot that I found in the top loop of one of the R's on line 6 in the word var. We were fishing one day. And what's interesting about this is there's a little more to the story, because on line 1 you'll notice that there is the word north. One day's journey north from this stone. Yeah. Norr is the way it's spelled. And if you look closely at the upper loop of the second R in the word north, the plateau of rock has been blown away because somebody tried to put a dot in the middle of the upper loop, and they hit it with too much force, and it destroyed that plateau of rock. Now, when you go to line 4, you have the word, that first word was Northmen, Norrmen. Yeah. On line 4, you have the word north. It's the exact same word, Norr.
Yeah, we still use that word. In Norwegian, we refer to us not as Norwegians, but as Norman, which is exactly the same. Yes, it's the same word.
Okay. Well, anyway, so if you look closely at that second R, there is no dot or anything in the upper loop, but there is a very pronounced, obvious dot between the legs on the lower part of the second R, which indicates to me that there's something about putting a dot in that second R that's important. And because they had the problem with the upper loop on the first attempt, they decided to put it between the legs to indicate some type of a change in the sound. And what I came to learn was in medieval times the language was coalescing, and so to indicate different sounds or different ways of saying certain runes, they would put modifiers on it like a dot or a short stroke. In this case, the palatal R was designated with a loop with a dot in the upper loop of the R. Now, I think what happened is they had a problem on the first attempt, and the second attempt they put it between the legs. But on the third dotted R, which is on line 6 in the word var, instead of putting it between the legs, they put it back where they wanted to put it, but instead of hitting it hard, they hit it with less force, so it made a much shallower dot than the dots we typically see in the inscription. But clearly it's man-made, it's in the right spot, in the right word, and it works. It's consistent with medieval practice.
Yeah, but the big deal is they didn't know this.
Well,
right?
Now I'm getting to that.
Yeah.
So that in itself is great.
Yeah.
But what really makes it important beyond everything else is that the dotted R was unknown to modern scholars until 1935, when they found 2 different examples, or 4 different examples, on 2 artifacts. One was a grave slab at Ukna Parish. The other was a bone that had a large inscription, a long inscription carved on it that also contained 2 dotted R's. And that was published in 1938. For the first time in modern history, the world knew about the dotted R. Well, that begs the question, how did the dotted R get on the Kensington Runestone in 1898 if it wasn't known until 1935?
Exactly.
I mean, that is something you can't argue and explain away. It basically proves all by itself, that little tiny dot proves the Kensington Runestone is medieval all by itself.
Yeah.
And it's just astounding, in my opinion.
And I have to, we touched this in part 1, so we'll not make too much a big of deal about it, but I have to, point out the obvious fact for those who ignore hard science like geology and cling desperately to linguistics, that they are at fault here, because I said in part 1 that the Black Plague came in the 1349, 1350. And the interesting thing, and we learned this as children in school even, that in Norway, and also the same would partly be true for Sweden too, is that the language was in super fluctuating. Not only is Norwegian the most varied language in the world compared to the population, but it also was the 1300s in super much change. We basically imported Danish during the 1300s and the 1400s, and ended up going away from the Old Norse, which is closer to Icelandic, ending up with more like Danish. And that means that the words written down in that period not only didn't adhere to strict grammar, because that they never did in ancient times anyway, but in addition, there would be so many variations possible just because of the times, because the Black Plague killed off the literate class. And in addition, when you have Gothlanders from the island Gothland and Norwegians, they were forced to relate to a common terminology. And all this kind of makes the runestone very vulnerable and special, because that means that whoever of this company were charged to write down stuff, they were having to, in a specific case, they were having to deviate more than probably you'll expect to find in, let's say, local Norwegian runestones of the time. You see what I mean?
Yeah, right. Well, in the medieval stones, one of the things that sticks out to me, and I wrote about this in my new book, and actually I can send you a PDF version of it so you can have it right away. Yeah. But I laugh at people like Professor Henwick Williams, who tries to argue that linguistics is a science, and that he understands scientific method, and that it can be applied linguistically and runologically to things like the runestone. And he's, first of all, he's dead wrong. I mean, it's not a scientific process. This is as much of an art as anything else. Yeah. But I can tell you from the get-go that he doesn't know what he's talking about, because immediately what basically the argumentation that the runologists make is they say, oh, the Kensington runestone has runes, therefore it is a runestone. And once you say that we call it a runestone, then it has to suddenly conform to this, and this, right? Mm-hmm. To the standard that we have set for what constitutes a runestone. And that is fundamentally flawed from the get-go, because what you're doing is you're trying to tell something what it's supposed to be, and if it doesn't fit, then somehow there's something wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And that is just a basic fundamental flaw from the very start. Because when you look at a question like this, you don't make any assumptions. You don't start by telling it what it's supposed to be. You just record information, you document the facts, and you allow it to tell you what it is.
Yeah.
That is the fundamental flaw of their investigation. And to sit there and try to argue and convince people that you're a scientist and that you can apply scientific method when from the very get-go you screw it up in the way that you approach it is laughable to me. But the world just doesn't understand this, right? And they think these guys, because they're PhDs, and I'm a lowly forensic scientist, that somehow they're right and I'm wrong.
Yeah, but it's boiled down to the weakness of the subject matter itself that they are PhDs in, because it has to be an interpretation art when so much data is lacking.
Yes.
If they had all the recorded words ever uttered since the dawn of mankind, if they had that neatly stored in a computer in a database, written words, oral words, everything, they had like the Akasha Chronicle, as we say in spirit lingo, then okay, maybe we could make it into a science. But they have like, what do they have? 1%? Not even that? So they can't assume to know. And you're right. You have to take the evidence and then develop a theory that the evidence forces, which they haven't done. But you kind of did that with the hooked X. But before we go there, you were supposed to tell us about the secret dating method, which is important for a land claim.
The Easter table dating code. Yeah, that one I got to give to Dick Nielsen. He was the one, because again, there were 3 different runes that had marks on them that were singled out. 2 of them were already known. They were quite well known, but the 3rd one I found, and again, I didn't know what the hell it was, but in the very first symbol carved on the stone, which is the number 8, which is in pentatic numbers, which are Arabic in origin, which begs the question, what is a Muslim numbering system doing on a Scandinavian runestone? That in itself is an interesting question, and the answer is obvious. But there was a dot in this number 8 in the second bar that apparently was singling it out. And these 2 other symbols or runes on the face side of the inscription, one in Skiar and the other one in Ilu on line 9, when you pull those out separately and you look at them from the standpoint of the possibility of maybe their codes that were meant to be used to plot on the medieval Easter table, Ole Worm's medieval Easter table from 1314. Something incredible happens. And basically, dating, one of the ways that they dated things, I know they did this all over Gotland because I saw it all over the place, inscribed on bells, carved over doorways and churches. And what they would do is date things by this Easter table dating method. And what they would use is they would take the 19-letter Futhark at the time, or the alphabet, the runic alphabet, and they would pull out one letter from the first 7 characters, which they called the Sunday letters. And then the rest of the 12 runes in the alphabet were what they called golden years. And then you would apply those to this Easter table. But to get a date, you need one more thing. You need a column number. Well, if this 8 that seems to be singled out is the number we use, and we plot the L, which is perfect for a golden year, the U in Ilu, which is singled out, which is perfect for a Sunday letter, and the number 8, and we put them on the Easter table, which has over 500 years on it. Guess what date we get?
1362. Yeah,
1362, the exact number that's carved on the Kensington runestone. So what it appears is going on is that the monk encoded the same date that's carved on the inscription using the medieval Easter table dating practice consistent with that time period. And, the question becomes, why did they do that? Well,
yeah, why doubly write it? Both covertly and overtly.
Yes, and the overt way, you could easily change the date by adding another stroke to any one of the numbers that are on that stone. For example, there's 3 horizontal bars in the second number, which is 3 in 1362. Well, if you added another stroke below the third line, suddenly you've added 100 years, right?
Right.
Well, guess what? Can't do it because they protected the date from alteration by encoding the same date again within the inscription, using a practice consistent with the time. And that begs the question, why was the date so important? Well, as you brought up earlier, I've made the claim for a long time that it is indeed a land claim, which would explain perfectly why the Templars came to North America after they had been persecuted to establish a new home, a new sanctuary, but they chose to come halfway across the continent. Well, I think that was because they wanted to make a claim of a large geographic area, if not the entire continent. But in fact, what the Runestone says is 8 Goths and 22 Northmen on this acquisition business or taking up land from Vinland, which is the east coast, the northeast coast of North America.
Yeah, I have some new data points there I want to discuss with you later, but go on.
Well, the data point, I think, is the Newport Tower.
Right.
Because I think they're contemporaneous. So that's on the northeast coast, far to the west. Well, I would say, at least to Kensington, that's half the continent right there. So
yeah, so they already had claimed the east coast. We know this not just
east coast, right?
Yeah, not just because of Vikings having traveled there for so many hundred years, but also, the Sinclair journals shows that the Templars continued.
Yes.
But and it's so Templar of them to put in a secret code.
Yeah, put it that way.
But the interesting thing I learned from one of your shows in American Unearthed, I learned something I didn't know, and most people probably don't know it, and that is that back in these days, this was the common practice to put down claim stones.
Oh, yeah.
They even did it far into modern times. The explorers, you were talking about how the French probably tried to rob some land from USA. So this was a well-established practice. Put down a stone, a date, and a claim. And then you have it. And I have to add, Richard Nilsson, he determined an internal date of 1401 from one of the main artifacts runic texts.
And 1402.
And 1402. And
dated the exact same way.
Exactly, right? And this corroborates because after that, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Norse-style sod building close by, which was carbon dated to when?
Right.
1405 AD, which, it's not an exact science. It can be plus, minus.
You're talking about Spirit Pond.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is the same case.
Well, the runestones, Spirit Pond runestones may have been dated earlier, a few years earlier than when they established those longhouses there. But like you said, C14 data, there's a plus or minus artifact. Yeah. I mean, they're basically spot on. They match, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if anyone is wondering, how would Vikings be involved with Templars? I just have to clear that little historic bit up too.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, because the Vikings were renowned. I mean, today they have a bad rap as pirates and brutes, which is kind of changing due to new science, thank God.
Yeah.
But they were fearsome warriors when they were in war, and they were very popular. For example, the Byzantine emperor hired in his vanguard. He preferred hiring Vikings. And many Vikings went into the Crusades, and through there they encountered the Templars. And we know there's even one of the most popular novels in Sweden is about a Swedish Templar. Okay. So that we know there were many, many Templars who were Scandinavians. And by the way, in Bergen, that I've told before, we have old chapels, because if Sinclair went to the West Coast, which he said in his diaries that he did, King Magnus.
Yes, and he would regularly travel to Norway to meet with the king, because he had, he was the Earl and he reported to the king, and he spent a lot of time there. And he talks about visiting with explorers who had been to the Western lands that had returned to Norway.
Yes, and here is some corroboration of that, because the Cistercians are very important. You've pointed that out. They are like the spiritual baseline of the Templars. And I'll tell you, The book I'm sending you, which I said before in part 1, claims that the first Christians here weren't Catholics, they were of the Celtic Church. Well,
yes.
In addition, we have Cistercians. They were one of the first. The oldest...
The Tyrannensians.
Pardon?
Are you talking about the Tyrannensians?
No, I'm pronouncing it badly, but Cistercians.
Oh, Cistercians, okay.
Cistercians. So we have a cloister in Bergen, which is where they would go with their ships. That was the main port on the west coast, before they went to Iceland and Greenland and Vinland.
Right.
We have the light cloister, Lysekloster in Norwegian. This was founded in 1146 and it was in function all the way up to 1536, long after Sinclair and Company visited. In addition, we have Nonneseter Chapel, which lived between 1130 and 1507. And the interesting stuff there is that it was taken over by the now defunct Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony. And who were they? Well, incidentally, they were founded in Egypt, just like the Celtic Church, which had pagan roots from Egypt.
Right.
And it fused with the Knights of Malta in 77. So they don't exist anymore, but those took over the cloister when the Cistercians were closed down. So we see here a theme of the same kind of circles having the main spiritual land positions in the west coast of Norway, all the way through 1300s and 1400s when your people, the Templars, were so active here. So it's not outrageous if anyone thinks that, oh, Vikings and Templars, that's completely different. No, they are of the same ilk, because Norway was very late to be Christianed. And in the Sinclair journals, they talked about how they were honoring the triple goddess and how he was learning about Norse gods. Well, I can corroborate that too, because in Scandinavia, because we were so late to be Christian, and like I said, the first Christians weren't even Catholics, they were much more liberal Celtic Church. Well, aspects of Norse and Sami, as well as Norse and Inuit cultures, have overlapped. In Norway, Norse and Sami, for the people who doesn't know, is our natives. They're pretty much like the Native American Indians.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And the Inuit in Greenland, they reflect the diversity of belief systems when they were coexisting, because they had both in the original Norse sagas. You can see, for example, the Greenland sagas attest to coexistence of indigenous pagans and Christian beliefs within the Norse society. Eirik saga, Eirik the Red, Eirik Rauda, transmits the most well-known and extensive descriptions of a shamanic seder, which is a ritual performed by a volva, which is a prophetess, that bears resemblance to those practiced by Samis and indigenous Siberian people, or people some are marked as others, throughout the Norse texts. So many famous accounts of these interactions survive in the Vinland sagas, the Greenlander saga, and Eirik the Red saga. And if they did this in Norway itself, obviously they would do it all over the place. They would, like you say, they befriended the Indians. Well, small wonder, right? They did it with the Greenlanders. Yeah. Sure, there was some conflict in the beginning, especially. There were some fights between not just Inuits, but also American natives. But that was all the way back. But when they became Christians, because they were Celtic Christians, even more they had this parallel practice going on, where they would, and I told you about these lodges that were commemorating Norse traditions all through the 1300s. Yeah. So all this stuff is, I think, is small nuggets of information that substantiates the claims made in the Sinclair journals that if it was a forgery, how on earth would the forgers know these subtle points, right? Everything matches.
Well, and that is really what I think pushes them over the edge. It's they say the devil's in the details, where the truth is in the details. And we're talking about little nuggets of information that are just not known in multiple different fields. So it's like, where do you get somebody that has such a knowledge base, a deep knowledge base in all these different areas? There is nobody that has that. So now you're talking about a group of people, and the more you add to this so-called cabal working behind the scenes to create this fake document for what reason, right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense, and really speaks to the authenticity of these documents and the incredible history that they contain, which, admittedly, Al, I'm rooting for the journals and the CDOC and all of this more than anybody, because it corroborates everything I've done for the last 20 years. And on one hand, you could make the argument that I'm horribly biased in support of these documents, but on the other hand, I know the research we've done is solid. The facts have lined up. Everything is fitting together. And these things slide in and fill in so many holes so beautifully.
Yeah.
Yes, I would love it. There's nothing I would love to see more. But I would certainly call out the problems if I could find them. I just can't find them. And so it's really working out well right now, I have to say.
Yeah. No, it's your prerogative to be in favor or be biased towards this, because you're the one who is having this stuff. So you have to develop a sympathetic theory, and then the criticists have to try to find holes in it. Of course, you have to do it too, but
absolutely.
As long as you go with the evidence, that's what you have to do. That's scientific. You have to try to see how can these be authentic.
Absolutely.
And now we come to the jewel in the crown, so to speak, because what seriously was unknown until I think you cracked the case was the whole hooked X phenomenon. So I guess we could just move on to that, because that is kind of the canary in the mine.
Canary in the coal mine.
Mine that tells the whole story, right?
Well, I think it really sort of brings it full circle.
Yeah.
The one of the things that happened as we were going through all this, and we found these dots and har and the dotted R and the dating code. And of course, the Grail code is another one, right?
Yeah.
The first four letters that are singled out by the carver are G-R-A-L, and in medieval Old Swedish, they spell Grail.
Also in modern Norwegian and Swedish.
Okay, so there you go. Consistency yet again. But, and then linguistically, runologically, I went to Sweden 5 times because we wanted to look at really what was an untapped database. And I think it's important for people to understand, because I get the question a lot of times, well, how the hell could you, who was, roughly educated by these scholars about runes, dialect, grammar, and dating, how could you go over to Sweden and find these things in their backyard that they live right there? I mean, how come they didn't know about this stuff? Well, it's a great question. And the answer is there's a reason. And the reason is that there is a treasure trove of medieval runic inscriptions on the island of Gotland, primarily on grave slabs, most of them mortared into the floors and walls of the churches, of the 99 churches on the island, of which I went to all 99 of them.
Oh, geez.
And I did. I'm anal retentive. And so and once I got to a certain point, I said, screw it, I got to just do them all,
Yeah.
And I'm glad I did, because I can say that I did,
And this was Cistercian territory, right?
All Cistercian, every one of them. Every one of them. Now, at the time, I didn't understand the significance. I certainly do now. But in any case, we found everything. We found all the language, the dialect, the grooves, the runes, the grammar. All these features were consistent with the 14th century, and everything on the runestone was consistent with that database. Now, the reason that the scholars had not seen this material is because it was the last place in Scandinavia that they studied the runic inscriptions of Sweden. And they only started publishing those papers in the early 2000s.
Wow, that was even after you started this journey.
Yeah, I mean, they were. I remember they were publishing them even after I had gotten back. Yeah. So they didn't have the information, and I just happened to be there at the right time. So it's not like I'm some brilliant guy. It was a function of timing. But believe me, if in the years since, and it's been 15 years since I was last there, if the scholars could have proven me wrong, I'd have heard about it by now, don't you think?
Everybody would.
Oh, believe me, they would have been shouting at the mountain.
They would have
right?
seized that. Yeah.
But anyway, the point is that really settled all of the language, runes, dialect features. But there was still one thing that was missing that I did not find on the island of Gotland, and that was the hooked X. And, here was one of the big mysteries that was one of the pieces of evidence that also, proved that the runestone was a hoax. And that was this crazy looking X character with the hook in the upper right arm being used for the letter A. And it doesn't look anything like the standard runic E rune or A rune, excuse me. And it was a mystery and nobody could figure it out. Well, I remember the first time I found one, actually Janet found it, in a different place other than the known hooked X's, that were on these 5 North American runestones. At one point, that was the only place they had turned up. We can't find them in the record, in the runic record in Scandinavia, so there's something wrong, right? Well, the first one I found was at Roslyn Chapel. And it was carved on a pillar inside the nave of the church, right next to the altar. And it's a slightly different version, but it is definitely a hooked axe. And my God.
But that's super important because what you do, not only do you find it in Europe, but you find it exactly at the spot where the usual suspects are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the next one that we found was in Columbus's sigla. He started using a hooked X in his signature or sigla. It's more of a symbol. It's not his name written out. It's a series of letters with lines and a sword symbol and dots, just like we have on the runestone, right? Mm-hmm. And that it's no question it's a hooked X. And this guy was, suspected to be a member of the Order of Christ, which was a post-put-down order of Templars that actually survived the put-down in 1307 and existed as an official Templar order in Portugal until 1835, for over 500 years after the put-down.
Hey, let's take a little short detour and dwell a little upon this because I have some points I want to discuss with you about Columbus and that. So we just take that now and then we go back to the hooked X.
Sure, let's
Because
go.
First off, Templars survived in Portugal, but I've looked into the history of the Order of Christ, and it was very soon degenerated. In other words, the real Templars didn't manage to keep control of it for a long while. Now, I've been trying to make sense of Columbus' part in this, because on the one hand, he's obviously privy to information, like we know he got stuff from Byzantinian sources and, of course, from the northwestern islands.
Sinclair's.
Yes, Sinclair's and even the Vikings that predated Sinclair. But, on the other hand, he's not a really nice person, Columbus. And
no, he was a jerk.
He was a bastard. So I have a theory I want to air with you, and I'm curious what you think about it.
Okay,
because this
cool.
theory was coming to me while I was reading and researching also your stuff. Because you mentioned Per Liljeström to me in part 1, which was Thor Heyerdahl's companion at the end when they wrote books about this. And Per Liljeström, he offers some very interesting information. Because it's not very known, but Columbus admitted in a letter to his son to have visited Iceland in February 1477, and from the bishop there and other learned men, he was informed that their people had discovered Greenland, Helluland, Markland and Vinland beyond the Western Ocean, and that Vinland seemed to extend southward indefinitely. No, this isn't the big deal. The big deal is this. I'm gonna, in the post commentary of this interview, I'm gonna inform people about the Greenland Mystery. I don't see a reason to spend time with you on it because that robs important time we have to discuss the hooked X.
Sure.
But an interesting point about the Greenland Mystery is so many people disappeared, especially from the western part, especially women. And Per Liljeström and Thor Heyerdahl claim that what Columbus did was that he took them as slaves. He brought them back to his Catholic, whatever, to his Mediterranean authorities and forced them to recount about the lands beyond the Western Sea. Now, the remainders of the settlements there fled to Vinland because, like I'm also going to tell people in the post-commentary, is how the Nova Scotia, what's it called? It's French.
The Medewan?
No, not the Medewan. The area where they lived in Nova Scotia. It's a French word. Where the ink starts. Lanceau or Meadow.
Lanceau Meadows.
Yeah. That wasn't Vinland. That was a ship colony.
Yeah.
It was used to... it was a ship repair station and a waypoint for voyages.
It was a purpose, where they would get fresh water and reload supplies and kind of take a break after they had crossed the North Atlantic.
Exactly, and they didn't call it Vinland. We know what they called it. They called it Leifsbudir, after Leif Erikson, who discovered it. So, the thing is, they fled down there. Now, here's the interesting theory I have. If Per Liljeström is right, if he took these Norse people as slaves, because he was a big slaver, and this might be a wild notion, but here's what I'm thinking. He gets all this information. He has like a foot within some fragmented Templar heritage, but he's not like he's not like a, Jesus and Mary and all that. He's not a heretic like that. Yeah. But he has enough information to know something's up. So why did he sail with the Templar flags on his ship? I think because he had all this information, I think he thought or expected or feared the possibility that he would encounter a Templar state on the East Coast, because there were numerous attempts to establish not just the Sinclair journals. We have also from Viking sources so many attempts to establish colonies there. Hundreds of people went over throughout these years. And also from the Sinclair journals and La Croma document that they did this. Yep. So I think he couldn't know what was awaiting him. So he went there like in full boosting Templar modus, right? Yeah. And then when he lands and he sees there's nothing here, just and he was a racist, so he thought, some low-life natives. Then is when they went amok and started to... Because in the beginning they were cautious and careful, but when they were sure there was nothing here, they started to rob. They took slaves.
Oh, that's
right. They went all the way back. Look what we got for you.
Okay, now I understand. So what you're saying...
This is my theory.
Yeah, I think so. Just in a nutshell, the reason he was flying the Templar cross on his ships is so if he did happen to encounter the Templars, he would play that game.
Exactly.
And be welcomed. But when that didn't happen... and he realized that they weren't there,
all bets were off.
Then he could do what he wanted and be the pillaging, a-hole that he was.
Yes. Yep. So because he had access to all this information, he would expect to find Templars there.
Yep. He would not have been at all surprised. No, that's an interesting theory, and it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, the natives, it's not going to mean anything to the natives from his perspective, although I think it probably did mean something to them, but he did it for a different reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I like that. Cool.
I think the natives further north would have more meaning from these flags than, he ended up very south. He didn't exactly know where to go either. I don't think he was an initiate. I think he was someone who managed to collect initiatic info through his different sources, marrying into the Sinclairs, accessing the remnants of the Order of Christ, because that was degenerated at that point already.
Well, yeah, and he did not practice the spiritual side,
exactly,
or even the outward practical side of conducting himself as a member of the order. He was a greedy. One of the documents where we found more hooked X's was in his what he called his Book of Privileges, where he in 1406 or 1506 he wrote down shortly before his death everything that he was entitled to, that he was owed for his services on his 4 trips. And, he was so concerned with money and wealth and property.
Could he have gleaned something from the Sino brothers?
Maybe. Possibly. Yeah, he could have. Because we know that Antonio eventually went back, I think, but he was with Sinclair on the journey. We got a lot of information about the Zeno brothers in the next books, which have not been published yet.
Okay, we'll talk about that then. Let's get back to the hooked axe then.
Okay.
You did find specimens of it in the Narragansett stone and the three spirit pond stones.
The Narragansett runestone has one. There's 3 runestones in North America, or 3 different places where 5 runestones have been found that have the hooked axe. The Kensington stone, the Narragansett runestone in Narragansett Bay, and then the Spirit Pond runestones. Three stones found in a cluster together.
Is the Narragansett stone the same that was featured in American Unearthed, which is underwater?
Yep.
It had many clear hooked axes.
No. The Narragansett runestone only has one. The one you're thinking about is the Spirit Pond, has a whole bunch of hooked axes on it.
Yeah, which is underwater, right?
No, the one that went underwater is the Narragansett runestone, but that only has one hooked axe.
But a very clear one.
Unmistakable. It has 9 total runes, 7 on the top line, 2 on the bottom. The first one is the hooked axe on the second line.
Yeah, and is that acknowledged as a genuine, or are they claiming that to be a fake too? Because if that's a fake, it has to be scuba divers.
No, nobody's. Well, people are claiming it's a hoax without evidence. I've looked at it and I've determined the weathering is old, so therefore it's genuine. But to me, the hooked axe is one of the powerful pieces of evidence that it is real.
Yeah,
and we can date that thing back at least 100 years. To when certain people were just kids, and remember that stone back in the 1940s that are still with us today. So,
but I think the really smoking gun here is that the hooked axe is featured in just a specific. I mean, many people made runes, but this seems to be within a certain circle.
Very tight circle,
right?
Yes.
And it seems to be Norse, but Cistercian and Templar connected Norse, and that all means that the hooked axe has some kind of meaning that is special to them, and I think it's time to take that on.
Well, and the other thing you're going to see in the new book is we found examples of hooked axe in secret coded alphabets that were hidden in Iceland. Right. And that are now just being published online in the last few years, and colleagues of mine have brought them to my attention. And the other thing that we noticed is that there is a connection with the hooked axe to the Hebrew alphabet. That the straight line version of the hooked axe, or of the Hebrew aleph, looks like a hooked axe. And funny, that's the first letter in the alphabet being used for aleph, or A, the A sound, and it's being used for the A sound on the runestones in North America. And I think that there is a tangible connection between the hooked axe being used for the letter A and the Hebrew aleph. And of course, once you start to make a connection to the Hebrew alphabet, now you're getting into things like the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, and some of the esoteric teachings that we know that the Templars were involved in. Yeah. And here again is another connection that only goes to the Templars, and that fits along with everything else. And in fact, in the Cremona document, as you have not seen yet, but you will in my new book, there are at least 1, 2, 3, I'd say a dozen examples of the hooked axe used in numbers, pretty much in numbers, in Roman numbers, which is not unusual. They're only used once within these numbers, and it's, I think, to emphasize the importance. It's a sacred symbol that has multiple practical uses. One is as a letter or a sound, the other is as a number, but it also is just a standalone symbol that represents the ideology of these people, the whole concept of monotheistic dualism, and emphasizing the feminine aspect of the Godhead, which was vitally important to the Templars, which was vitally important to the Native Americans, and was the core of their relationship.
And the Celtic Church, mind you.
Well, it is the Catholic Church, but they don't emphasize the feminine.
No, the Celtic Church also had
Celtic Church, for sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there again, you see this consistency that goes into the use of this sacred symbol, which really was probably above everything else, symbolized the essence of their ideology and why it was so important and so sacred. And to put a hook on the X was also used as a plea of protection to safeguard and protect these documents, which includes not just the documents in the Cremona document, but we also see numerous hooked X's in the journals.
Yeah.
But the runestones are documents too. The Kensington runestone is a written document.
Yeah.
And it was a very sacred document. And they used the hooked X in the Kensington runestone 22 times.
Wow.
And that number 22 is also a sacred number in the Kabbalah and on the runestone. And it's they used confirmation codes within the inscription. It's not a coincidence. There are 22 hooked X's in the inscription, and there are, 8 Goths and 22 Northmen. And it just goes on and on and on. The levels of code and symbolism and meanings that are hidden within the Kensington inscription. It is just incredible.
It indicates it has to be Templars because we know they did stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are the guys that did this stuff.
Yeah.
And they had, everything fits, right? They had the means, the money, the motivation. It all fits. And of course,
but you must be giving credit for something because there is, from all this, there is one unavoidable conclusion, and you're the one who blew that lid, and that is that we know why they fled. We know why they were crushed.
Yeah.
They had a heresy, right?
Yeah.
And this heresy connects to Jesus and Mary, and before people freak out and invoke Dan Brown, remember, he didn't invent anything. He just took a popular, for example, we have the famous 1982 book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, right?
Yep.
So it's nothing new here. It's just that he popularized it, and because it became a novel and a movie and everything, nobody takes it seriously anymore. But the thing is, that's what they usually do in fiction. They take stuff from reality and they make a good story out of it. And in reality, which is always better than fiction, we have an ancient old tradition that is connected to the Templars, not just the Templars, but among else the Templars, that says, well, you can say it. It's your discovery.
Well,
Jesus and Mary
were married, they had children, and their children had children, and their descendants are alive today and walking on the planet. And, it's in many Christians, are obviously taken aback by this, and, it goes against their beliefs. And
that's their problem.
I mean, I look at it this way. I say, look, every single person that is walking on this planet today, all 7+ billion people, have ancestors that were alive 2,000 years ago, right? I mean, that's a documented fact. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have descendants that were alive 2,000 years ago. Every single one of us. Yeah. So why is it such a stretch to believe that these two people back then couldn't have had children that had children and have descendants that are alive today? I mean, it's so simple. It's so easy.
But it's not just a theory.
Absolutely. And it happened. I'm sorry, but it happened.
Yeah, but we found facts corroborating this. They found a tomb with the entire family names on it.
Say nothing if their names are written on boxes and their bones were found in the Telpiat tomb. I mean, give me a break. Come on.
Yeah. But how is it connected to the X? That's the question.
Well, that's really where this all comes full circle. Of course, we have really now at this point probably over 100 examples of the hooked X on documents, carved in stone, carved into churches, into various. My wife found one in She's pretty good at finding them in churches, as it turns out. One in Santa Maria de Olival Church in Tomar, Portugal, which is a Templar city, for God's sakes.
I thought it was poetic that it was Sinclair who found it, but it was your wife who discovered it?
It was my wife who found it. See, in the show, when you watch the show, and Janet is listening, hey, Jan, come here for a sec. Come here.
Give her credit.
We're talking about, remember we filmed the scene with Steve St. Clair at Tomar? And yeah, come here. So Al watched that episode, and he was just commenting that he thought it was the Sinclair descendant who found it. And that's not what happened. The hooked X at Tomar. Yeah, Santa Maria de Olival. But actually what happened, Al, is Steve, finds it in the show, right? Mm. But in real life, when we were filming, we were right before, when I was filming scenes with somebody, Janet was looking at columns in the church, right? Mm. And you found that hooked X. I did. And then what'd you do?
I took a picture of it, and then I showed it to Maria, producer, and I looked at her and I go, we just found our ending, didn't we?
Yeah.
She said, yep. And I said, I can't tell Scott, can I? And she said, nope, we're going to surprise him.
Oh, nice.
So we broke for lunch, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't tell me anything. And Janet and Andy and Maria and
Conspired.
Steve, everybody else knew but me. And they're kind of smirking around. But remember, nice. I was so dialed in because I was writing my final scene, right? I was writing up what I was going to say. And I had to change it, of course, when Steve shows me the hooked X. But as soon as the scene was over and they yelled cut, Steve goes, Scott, it wasn't me that discovered it. It was Janet. Janet found it.
Oh, but she wasn't a part of the show,
No, she wasn't. No, we couldn't write her in at that point. We'd already established the story, so we couldn't put her in it. But in real life, she was the one that found it.
That's wonderful. So your reaction is genuine.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I'm like, what? You got to be kidding me. And so I just vomited out that final diatribe, but I think it came across pretty well.
Yeah, but you could see he was so eager to show you. But he was like, no, come here, seriously, come here. He was so boiling over.
Well, he was, because, it was...
I know it makes sense. He's been carrying it for several hours, right?
Well, yeah, or at least... No, it wasn't that long. It was probably...
About 2 hours.
It was about 2 hours.
I was absolutely dying.
I know you were.
I was dying to tell you.
I know, and then they told me, and I'm like, what, Janet? Really? And then I thought about it. I go, of course, the goddess has to find the big ending.
Yeah. It makes sense. So it's still poetic.
That was a lot of fun. That was one of the best moments we ever had making the show.
But, of course, you argue in your books for the context of this entire thing, how it's all connected to the heresy, quote unquote, that they are bringing forward. And it does make sense. If they want to establish a Templar state in the East Coast, you would expect them to bake in these codes and of course, being a practicing esoterician, you know that codes are not just a signal. It's not just to give a message. It's also a way to commemorate the principles, or to honor the gods, or to manifest your...
Right.
It's like a magical act, right?
Yeah. Well, it's, the other thing that I thought about with this was it would have been the sacred symbol that was unique only unto them.
Yeah.
And so, the dating, the confirmation codes, the Grail embedded, all those other things that are part of the runic inscription. Above all else, you've got this hooked X that's woven throughout the entire inscription that nobody could make heads or tails of. And quite frankly, this is what confounded the scholars. This was one of the big items that they didn't know what to do with it, so they just made it go away. But above all of that, at the end of the day, one of the biggest discoveries that I talk about in the new book that actually happened several years ago was once we went public with the hooked X, and we explained what we believed it to symbolize and who it was associated with, and the only ones it was associated with being the Templars and the Cistercians, was, how far does it go back? And then, I thought I made a pretty good connection with, the crossed crook and the flail across the chest of Tutankhamun and his father Akhenaten, and symbolizing essentially the same ideology. But really, the most amazing discovery was when a biblical scholar and researcher, Charlie Pellegrino, had taken pictures of the lid of one of the ossuaries found in the Telpia tomb that you mentioned earlier. And it just so happened that this ossuary happened to be the one inscribed with the name Jesus, son of Joseph.
Oh my God.
And on the top was a symbol that they thought was a star symbol. And I don't know if you saw my blog post on this, but if you haven't, you have to go look at it because you'll see the symbol. And they sent it to me through another person that I knew that was a co-researcher with Charlie, Jerry Lutkin, on the Telpia team. And they said, we think this is a star symbol, but you know a little something about symbolism. What do you think this is? And when I opened the pictures up, I nearly wet myself. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. And I said, hey guys, this isn't a star symbol. This is a monogram of two symbols, a hooked X and the Tau cross. And interestingly enough, and it's centered beautifully on the lid, like where you would put the name if they were to carve the name of the person in the box. But what was amazing is I further added, I said, look, the hooked X is also a straight line stonemason version of the Hebrew Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the Tau.
And the Tau obviously also being connected to Egypt, ancient Egypt.
Yes, being connected to Egypt. It's connected to the Nilometer and all of that. The most important symbol in Egyptian iconography is the Ankh symbol, right? Which is a Tau cross with an egg-shaped handle. And
incidentally meaning life.
Meaning
which
life.
you could associate to birth, pregnancy.
Or resurrection, right? A new life, restored life.
Yeah.
But what I said to him was, what I think this is a monogram of two symbols, the hooked X and the Tau cross, which are the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And maybe it's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end.
And the sacred marriage.
Yeah. And it all fits, and it's all connected to Jesus, right?
And Mary.
And Mary, yeah. And she's right there too, right next to him in the temple.
Which is why they would have a monogram of representing both of them.
Yeah.
Unified in one, which is the child. Now, you have made, I think it was in your show, but I've seen you explain the symbol, how it could be representing this. It was in
the Narragansett Runestone episode when we were in the guy's house and we sat down and I went through the whole thing. Yeah.
But it's hard to do it without visuals, but could you just try to give it a short?
Yeah, I wrote it down in my notebook. I don't know if you saw that episode, but I actually wrote it down and I explained the whole thing.
Yeah, I did, but I'm thinking for our listeners so they can get an idea of why the hooked X.
Right. Yeah, well, you just take an X, the X symbol, and you chop it in half horizontally, and you create a V symbol on the top, and you invert it 180 degrees, and you have a peak symbol, which symbolizes the male. The V symbolizes the female. And then when you add the hook in the upper right arm of the V, you create another little V, which is a child, a daughter, inside the womb of the big V, or the mother. And according to legend, at the time of the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene was pregnant with their daughter Sarah. So you could make that connection, or you could make the connection to the Holy Trinity, which is, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I ask people in my lectures all the time, what's the Holy Spirit? And they kind of look at you and go, well, it's the Spirit in you. And I say, well, it really isn't well defined, is it? And they kind of shake their heads like, yeah. And I said, well, this is the way I look at it. You've got the Father, you've got the child. Who's missing?
Exactly.
Suddenly it becomes obvious, doesn't it?
It does. And there's even one funny kind of association too, which I don't think they were aware of, but you could also say it's the X chromosome married with the Y chromosome.
Yes. That's been suggested many, many times.
Oh, okay.
And although I haven't written about that, it's certainly plausible, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Is there anything else we should muse about this part of the story before we move on to the ending here?
Well, I think the only other thing that I would say is that this whole discussion about Jesus and Mary being married and the Da Vinci Code, which many people think is fiction, it is not fiction. It is, in fact, historical truth. And one of the pieces of evidence I would argue that supports that claim is in the Cremona document. And just to reiterate, the Templars found documents underneath the Tempel Mount sometime between 1110 and 1118. There's a narrative describing this discussion or this discovery in Jerusalem by 3 different authors that participated in the discussion in the Cremona document. Part of what they found were documents that talked about additional documents that had been hidden in the land of Onteora, which we now know as North America, but it was called back then. 6 decades after the discovery of those documents in Jerusalem, a Templar knight by the name of Sir Ralph de Sutherley mounted an expedition to the land of Onteora with the goal of recovering those documents that had been hidden there in the 1st century.
Jesus.
And he was going to recover those in the latter part of the 12th century. And he was successful in recovering some of those documents. He did not recover them all. But in the list of documents that he did recover in the 12th century that he brought back to Saborga, Italy, and gave his deposition, which is the second part of the Cremona document, in front of then Grand Master Odon in 1180, one of the documents that he recovered was a copy of the marriage document of Yeshua ben Yosef to Miriam Hasmonia of Cana. Wow. So one of those documents was the marriage document of Jesus and Mary Magdalene that had been hidden in North America for over 1,000 years.
And some people think this is a big deal, of course, but some people think, why would this be a big deal? I mean, it's just 2 people marrying and getting a child. Let's explain that, because if such a document were brought to light by the Templars, it would crumble the huge power base that was the Vatican. The Catholic Church was on its peak in the medieval ages. They controlled everything. And they crushed everyone. So if this was known, it would undermine the whole dogma that even led to the schism with the Orthodox Church in the first place, right? And so then Jesus isn't this vague ghost that they can abuse to excuse their power trips all over the place. Then it suddenly gets nailed down to something specific, and it's even something specific that they themselves are not heritage to. They can't even hijack that and say we're the ones, right?
I mean, you look to the Catholic Church, proof that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and that Jesus was just a human being and not this divine entity, which is the very foundation of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, this isn't something that could come out. It was just unacceptable. So, this was high stakes. This was extremely dangerous information, especially at that time period. I mean, it's still frowned upon to this day by millions of people around the world.
Yeah, you saw the reactions to the Dan Brown story.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it was a big story for a lot of reasons. One is that it was such a controversial thing. But one of the reasons why I think it was so popular and resonated with people is because it felt like it was true.
Exactly.
That it made sense. Yeah. That this is how the world really works, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, this whole story of fiction that was used to control the masses was one of the most destructive things that has ever happened in the history of humanity, in my opinion. Yeah. And I don't care who hears it. I don't give a. People need to hear it.
Yeah.
And you know, now we're getting the evidence to support the notion that this was fiction. But this is the time it's supposed to happen. So let it happen. You know, and what I say to people too is, look. Nobody likes to get bad news, right? Nobody wants to hear about awful things that happen, losing a loved one or whatever the case may be. But you know what happens after you get bad news? You're shocked, you mourn, and then you pull up your bootstraps and you move on with life. And the same thing will happen here. The world's not going to stop spinning. The truth is going to liberate a lot of people and give them strength. And force them to look inward to maybe find another way to answer those big questions in life without the guilt and, you know, all the crap that goes with it. And I'm hopeful for that. I know you are. And really it starts with bringing forth the truth. And that's what we've been trying to do. That's what we're going to continue to do. And I don't care who doesn't like it.
Amen to that.
Will set us all free.
Yes, indeed. Amen. But, you know, if they had any wits, the church, they would seize this story because they have become so completely irrelevant, not just practically and powerfully, but also spiritually. This could actually bring some meaning and interest back to the Christian tradition, basically, because this is what the original Christians themselves tried to. This was what it was all about. Have you read the Jesus documents by one of these three authors of the Holy Grail?
Oh, by Michael Bagent. And Henry Lincoln.
Yeah, but you know, Jesus documents was. I think that was just his book, wasn't it? Bagent's book?
I can't remember. You know, I haven't read that particular one.
Oh, you should. That's probably the best any of them ever made. And he makes, first off, people understand how many documents supporting this case exist. Second, they will understand how much, when these documents surface, they are destroyed or just confiscated away from public scrutiny.
Right.
He lies it all out there. And he also makes a very good case for the original Christianity. You know, the Paul, as you call him in English, was the founder of the Roman Catholic Church. But he was an enemy. Not only did he hunt down Christians for sport, he was a mercenary who was hunting down Christians. Yeah. And then he has this bullshit revelation. You know, if he wants to crush Christianity, a much better way to go about it than hunt down and kill Christians is to hijack the entire thing. And that's exactly what he did. Yep. And the first Christians who were James, brother of Jesus, Jacob, he was heading the church. And you know what, brother of Jesus and the original congregations in the Middle East, you know what they used to call Paul?
Huh.
They called him Paul the Liar. And Paul, of course, obviously never met Jesus. So we are dealing with a religion today that basically has nothing to do with the original Christianity. So I'm pretty sure the original Christianity, the original circles that inherited, that was left when Jesus vanished from the story, this was probably the core thing in their spiritual belief. And so the Templars are the real heritage to this story, as I see it.
And the Cathars specifically.
Yeah.
Were, I mean, it's ironic, you know, that the Catholic Church would persecute and destroy the very order that was practicing the closest thing to ministry, if you will, of Jesus than even the church. But they wouldn't kowtow to their rules, so they had to be eliminated. Which is, that's what they did.
Yep.
It's what they still do.
Still do, at least spiritually. Now, one last thing about this story, and that's, you mentioned, there's a loose thread I have in my notes from part 1. Because in the Sinclair documents, and in the Cremona docs, you mentioned that there was many treasures, not just the head of Baphomet, but also, for example, the Grail, San Grail, Holy Blood, San Grail in French, right? Holy Blood, it means. So the Grail, but also the Ark. And an interesting thing you mentioned in part 1, which you should clear up now, is that you think part of the code in the Kensington Stone refers to not 10 people, but the 10 commandments.
Yeah, I think so, because in the ritual of the York Rite that I talk about, where I made this discovery of the cryptic code, which is the title of my book, was the numbers correspond to specific numerical mentions of things in the ritual. And without going too deep into the ritual, one of the things we learn is what goes into and onto the Ark of the Covenant. But what we discover in the ritual that goes back to the Enochian mysteries is that the 3 Grand Masters decided to build a secret vault beneath the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle within the tabernacle is a traveling temple, but within the Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum, if you will, inside the Temple of Solomon. And so what they did was they put a copy of all the true treasures in the secret vault, which was 9 arches below the Holy of Holies. And it was the 3 Grand Masters who built the secret vault. And then in the ritual, and what tipped me off to this code was in the lecture portion of the degree when they said, and the other 8 arches were built by 22 men from Gebel. And I went 8 and 22. Those are the first 2 numbers in the Kensington runestone. And that's what started me on the code, because those are the first 2 numbers. Well, as you follow the ritual, the numbers 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from the stone. We had a camp. We were fishing one day. After we came home, found 10 men red from blood and death. Well, interestingly enough, in the ritual, the Ark of the Covenant comes into the story at this time, and then somebody is killed and literally covered from head to toe in blood. And then the second mention of the second 10, I believe, corresponds to the second Ark that is a true copy of the Ark that's in the Holy of Holies. So,
yeah, because they knew how to build one, because in the Cremona documents you said that the manual to build it.
Yeah, and so suddenly we've got 2 arks, right? The mention of 2 10s, and the 10 commandments would be one of the things inside of the Ark of the Covenant, not the only thing, but probably the most notable thing. And so
these guys must have brought one of the Ark as part of the treasure.
Well, as I said, what if I told you that the secret of the Ark of the Covenant wasn't where it was, but how to make it?
Okay, so they brought that secret at least, how to make it.
So that secret, well, maybe they brought more than one. Who knows?
Yeah.
I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Yeah, okay. We'll revisit this case to be sure.
We'll revisit this in due time.
But when you say Enochian, it's interesting that in a letter from Gerard Mercator, we know, the Mercator, that is, but the Mercator line is called after him. He wrote a letter to John Dee, who was big on Enochian, in 1577, where he cites the lost work of James Knox describing an expedition to Vinland, who returned with 8 men in 1364. Do you think this could be our people?
Yeah, I do.
Because we also have in the sagas of Iceland, they say the last expedition mentioned in the sagas was in 1347 when a vessel of 18 men came from Markland, that is Nova Scotia, to Iceland with a cargo of wood. They tried to bring it to Greenland, but the small ice age had settled in, so they couldn't even get to Greenland. Could this be, do you think these are different people, or could these be?
I would bet that there's a Templar connection to all of these stories. I can't say with certainty, but I would bet my bottom dollar.
I'd like to find out if the bishop, Erik Upse, was Cistercian, because he went to find Vinland in the year of 1121 to Christian them. In other words, he knew there were colonies of Vikings there and that they haven't been Christian yet. So if he could go there as early as 1121, I'd like to know if he was Cistercian.
The Cistercians were around in 1121. Bernard joined the order in 1113, so whether he was connected to them or not. But remember, even if he's with a different order, as you know, we have Freemasons within the Vatican, and I'm sure that there are Jesuits within the Masonic order. People aren't always who they seem to be.
Yeah. Or they can be,
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, there can be different layers to people, that's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I don't think it's always sinister that, he's a Jesuit and a Mason, so he's betraying one of them. Right. In his mind, he can be both, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, okay, I think we got it then. Oh, yeah, one more thing. Thomas Reyersgård in 2001 launched the theory that the Kensington party was Cistercians from Gotland. He agrees, but he says that the 10 dead wasn't killed by Indians, but as a result of the Black Plague. Do you put any stock in that theory?
Yeah, I knew Tom Reyersgård, and he was a really good fella. I actually went to his home and talked to he and his wife Camilla, and they were wonderful people. He died a couple of years after I met him, or like a year after I met him. He had cancer, but I really liked his idea, and it could very well be plausible. As you know, it could have, the 10 men could have maybe died from plague, and we're talking about the 10 commandments at the same time. It could be both.
Multi-layered,
We know that they brought plague. We know that Europeans brought plague prior to, historical contact. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. But Tom was a progressive thinker. I remember when I was at my lecture, the first lecture I gave in the Kensington Runestone, he was there. And afterwards he came up to me and he was so giddy and happy with my findings because I didn't realize it at the time, but it supported the book he was about to publish. And like I said, he was a very bright guy. He was a lawyer. He was a gentleman, and I respect, everything that he wrote about. He would even say, look, I don't know for sure if it's true, but I think it's plausible, and I agree with him.
Yeah. And in part 2, you made a big deal out of how the Templars and the natives got along. And I have to say, there are circumstantial evidence for that too. We have the archaeologist Alice Beck-Kehoe, who said it was definite contact between Norse and natives at least as far back as 1300. And not only does it substantiate the Kensington expedition, but she speaks of historic sources, to blonde Indians among the Mandane, but also to signs of tuberculosis among Indians around the year 1000. And that means that they came from Europe, obviously, and brought it over. And also the native memory about their ancestors' Red Horn and their encounter with redhead giants. And the Sioux woman from the Sioux tribe, Susan Wingrove, in 1935, she told anthropologist Ruth Landers about an old Sioux memory of a visiting ship during the spring where 38 sailors or /warriors with shell painted on their clothes. Yeah. So one thinks that could be that. But the most telling evidence of all to support the fact that there was also friendly relations is the DNA signature, because Iceland is one of the most DNA researched places in the world for obvious reasons we don't have to get into now. And there is this DNA signature of that into Iceland entered a Native American, not Inuit, Native American bloodline around the year 1000. And that's when the first Viking American Indian child was born. A study found. And so, that just seals the case.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if you want to explore this contact issue that we've been going through, there's plenty of avenues to explore DNA. I think the DNA is the one thing that many people just accept as being true. Yeah. But there's multiple lines of evidence. They all converge on this and support it. And there's really nothing that doesn't support it. I mean, there isn't any evidence in conflict with it other than people just don't want to change the narrative. And that's not good enough. It's just not.
No, it's not. Okay. And last thing, you've been involved in TV.
Right.
What's the shows you've done?
Well, I've done little things over the years, but the first major thing we did was a documentary called Holy Grail in America.
I love it, man.
Yeah. Well, that was an outgrowth of the whole Kensington Runestone research, and I was featured pretty prominently there. And then we did another show called Who Really Discovered America, which was basically the network, because Holy Grail in America did very well. They thought, well, is there more, controversial artifacts? And I said, Jesus, there's all kinds of them.
Never ending.
And I said, it's endless. And then eventually, so we did another 2-hour documentary called Who Really Discovered America. And then they asked me if we could do a series, and I said, absolutely. And then, we pitched America Unearthed, and it got picked up. And then we did 3 seasons of that from 2012 to 2013 or 2015.
America Unearthed. That's like different subjects each episode?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, and what's your role there?
I was the host, and a lot of the subject matter was my research. And so
so I really hope it comes back, because even though it has this format that especially Europeans hate, but every American show has that format today. It's nothing you can do about it, right? It's the same format you see in Ancient Aliens and in Oak Island Story. But if you can look past this format, then there's a lot of good information coming up there. And like I told you off air, every second show there is something connected to the Masons or the Templars. Even when it's not expressed, if you look closely, bam, there it is.
Yeah, well, and a lot of that is not accidental, but that's my influence.
Right. You kind of sneak. I mean, you're sneaking the Templars in every second show, even when it's not about the Templars.
Well, it seems like they sneak in on their own. It's not like they don't need my help.
No. But I mean, even when it seems not to be about it, if you're really alert, you can see that. Oh. This is connected. You know what I mean? Yeah. I like that. That's nice.
There's a thread there too. Yeah. It's amazing how often that happens. But I do think that the tradition that they were a part of has been over here many times. And so, it's going to dovetail with not just the Templars, but the tradition that they're a part of.
Exactly.
It's been a wonderful opportunity to be part of this show. If it doesn't come back, we've done almost 50 episodes, 49. Yeah. That's a pretty good run, and I'm proud of the work we've done. And if we get more opportunities, we'll make the most of it, I promise.
That's just wonderful. Well, we'll root for that, and we'll tell our listeners if it is back on air.
Oh, yeah, and I'll let you know. I'll definitely let you know.
Yeah, and until then, they can find it the obvious places where people go to find that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, have you talked about that show on Coast to Coast AM?
Oh yeah, sure.
I think I heard an interview with you with George Norrie about that. Yeah,
George Norrie, and I've been with Jimmy Church many times, and Ian Punnett when he was hosting the show. I've been on the show many times.
Yeah, I have respect for Ian Punnett and what's the other the UFO guy. The real reporter in Coast to Coast, George Knapp. Those two guys are great.
George Knapp, yep. Yeah. Ian Punnett was great. Yeah. And actually, what was interesting? He lived in Minnesota for a while, and I gave a lecture to a Templar group, SMOTJ. I don't know if you know who they are, but in any case, he showed up at the lecture. I didn't know it at the time.
He sat because he's a bishop in some church.
Yes. And one of the things that he turned me on to with the hooked X, which is on the Kensington Runestone, and is what I'm calling a sacred symbol that the Templars navigators and cartographers used, and obviously the author and carver of the Runestone and several other North American runestones that are connected to the Templars. But he was the first one that put me on to the connection to the Hebrew Aleph. And he asked me a question in that lecture. And like I said, I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was scouting me for the interview. And then when the interview came out, I recognized his voice, and I said, "Wait a minute, were you the guy sitting in the back of my lecture?" He just kind of laughed, you know. But I said, "That was a really interesting comment." Well, he turned out to be right on, because the Hebrew Aleph is basically a straight line stonemason's version of the hooked X. You know, I mean, the runes are built off of basically straight lines for the most part. Yeah, and that's kind of, if you think about the hooked X, it looks like the Hebrew Aleph, and it's being used for the A sound, or the A sound in runes.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you one thing off air about the hooked X.
Okay.
It was actually the first thing I mentioned to you when we had our first call.
Oh, okay, that sounds great.
But I don't want to spend time on the show for that. So actually, I think this wraps it up. Okay. So it's just left to thank you so much for your very generous and patient accounting of this huge story, and I look so forward to have you back to go into more details about it.
Oh, there'll be more for sure, and I appreciate it, Alice. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has.
All right.
Now, 6 hours we've done, so it's probably going to be a year or so until we talk again. But as soon as you have the book out, you contact me, you tell me, and come back and promote it.
Yeah, the next one, okay.
Yeah, because it's still such a big story that, you know, what's all the fuss about? Well, that's the big story. And that's what you cover in two of your books, and probably also the new book.
Yep.
It's a huge topic, so I can assure you what we'll do. I'll have you back when your new book is out, and we go more into depths of the big ramifications, right? I mean,
fine.
It's such a huge story that I want both you and probably also Butler on because this isn't a story that is exhausted in one mere show. So I think in the future you come back and we go deeper into that part of it, and I can also get Alan on to corroborate and substantiate.
Okay, sounds good.
And then you can go much more into the journals next time we have you on when your new book is out.
Okay, well, I'm happy to do that.
By the way, I've even discovered Janet Muir, or whatever her name is, and Don Rue. So I know about...
Oh, great.
Yeah, right. You mentioned those. I know about them now. By the way, you're publishing this book too, but it seems that Janet Muir already has published parts of the...
Diana Muir.
Yeah, Diana. She's published parts of the...
Well, she's only published the first of 20 books.
Right. Okay.
But it's fairly extensive, and it was designed to sort of generate some interest. And it hasn't gotten out to a wide audience yet. But, you know, I can talk a little bit about the journals. Now, you know, and that's what I'm working on now. But we've actually got some new information that's related to the Cremona document that actually dovetails with Diana's journals. This is the first time we've had an overlap. And it's such a complicated story with Don Rue and his people. Although I'm going to be getting more information. It's like, well, how can you be getting more information? I mean, isn't it all part of the same thing? Well, yes, it is part of the same thing. And why is it coming out in pieces? And I can explain why that is. It's complicated, but it actually makes a lot of sense.
You did explain some of it because Jackson, he divided it up to different people. Clever, because of the Vatican people, right? So
I wasn't sure what we talked about. I don't recall everything.
You mentioned that, so
perfect.
I think that wraps it up for now.
Okay, sure. Hey, listen, I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's really fun to meet you. I look forward to someday meeting you in person. This will be great.
Same here. Excellent, Scott. I'll let you go now then.
Right.
Just drop me a message either here on Skype or on email when you want to reconnect, and we'll take it on part 2.
Yeah, well, I'm available anytime. I really enjoy our conversation. And, a lot of times when I do interviews, I don't get a chance to talk about some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying it because you're cutting to the bone on this. And it's important that we do that because it's a problem.
Yeah, I agree. And this is what we do, man. In depth.
Well,
that's why they like us.
Well, good. I'm glad they like it. Well, and that's what I would like to focus on as well.
Yeah.
Comfortable conversation.
Exactly. Okay.
All right. Well, listen, that was fun. And thank you so much for having me on the show. This is really fun. I meant what I said.
Okay.
I appreciate the more in-depth analysis, and I really think part 2 is going to be even more fun.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent.
All right, Al. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I'll be in touch.
Yeah, ditto.
Okay, Al. Take care.
All the best.
All righty.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that completes this session today, which was on the longer side, even for our forum standards. Now, I'll not keep you hanging for much long, but I do want to contribute a few conclusions as I was harboring in this show. And there's first one thing I want to set the record straight, and that's regarding the Vinland settlement. Now, just to recap the basics, and of course, for everything we're saying, there's so many things we don't have time to say. But one thing that has to be understood is Erik the Red. Erik Raude, as we call him in Norwegian, was banished from Iceland. And that's when he went further west and established the first permanent settlement in Greenland. This was in the year 986. Obviously, he didn't go back to Norway, so they knew there was stuff in the west. How much, how detailed, who knows? But he went there, he established a permanent settlement there. There wasn't anything permanent prior to this, granted. But then Leif Erikson, who by the way was a Christian, probably though a Celtic Christian, in year 999, which was not more than mere 13 years after, rescued 2 shipwrecked men in Vinland. And he's been given the credit of being the first, but that's ludicrous. Even the sagas admit it wasn't. The fact that he rescued shipwrecked people there prove that others went there before. But, there was probably just random, there was no organized attempt. I mean, they had more than enough land where they wanted to. Greenland in English, was called green, because it was Greenland. This was before the small ice age, and it was easier to go from Norway to Iceland to Greenland. This became harder in the 1300s, when not just because of the Black Plague and lack of people and resources, but also because it coincided with the Ice Age. Now, the casual tone and reference to these areas west of Greenland in all these sagas that's kept suggest that it wasn't seen as particularly significant by the contemporaries. It was assumed to be public knowledge, which tells you how much traffic there really was. So Leif wasn't the first European in America, though he has been credited that, and he actually heard the story of merchant Bjarni Herjolfsson, who sighted land west of Greenland after having been blown off course. So maybe Bjarni was the first, but he was certainly among the first to be recorded and significant enough that Leif later heard about it. So Leif followed his course, Bjarni's course, and he named then Baffin Island Helluland. So the saga of Erik the Red mentions 2 other settlements in Vinland, actually. A settlement called Straumfjord, I guess you would say in English, which lay beyond, they describe it in detail, lay beyond Kjalarnes, as they call it, and the Wonderstrands. And one called Hop, located even farther south. Only the gods know how far south they really went. Now, the ruins at Baffin Island are identical to Norse buildings in Greenland, and carbon-14 dating reveals the valley to have been habitated around 1300, whilst Norsemen lived in Greenland. So this isn't just a question of how early, but also how late. So what is the big deal about Templars and Norsemen going in that area at that time? When we know there were people, Norsemen in Canada, at the same time as they were in Greenland. And in fact, in 2012, Canadians discovered them all over the place, also in Willows Island, Nunavik, Avayalik Islands, and in Tanfield Valley, where Norse textiles are found. In the year 1007, Thorfinn Karlsefni, also known as Thorfinn the Valiant, and his wife Gudrid colonized Vinland. So this was an official colonization attempt with more than 250 people from Greenland, and remained in Vinland for at least 3 years. After a cruel winter, he headed south and landed at Strömfjord. He later moved to Strömsøy because the current was stronger there. There were some conflicts with the locals. Like I said in the show, it hasn't all been peace and love all the time. In fact, there's been battles with both the Amerindian natives and the Inuits. But there's also signs of peaceful relations, as the two sides bartered with furs and skins for food and red cloth, which the natives tied around their heads as a sort of headdress. And I think it was Gudrid, Thorfinn's wife, who eventually ended up in Rome and accounted for the lands west of Greenland. The Pope, the Vatican, was very interested in learning about this, which we didn't mention in the show. Who knows, maybe it was because they suspected a Templar refuge to be there, or maybe it's just because they was in general interested in more land, more people to Christian, more power to expand their territory. Indeed, they had perpetual conflicts in the east, so why not expand where they could? But at any rate, we know that Helge and Anne Stine Ingstad, the Norwegian archaeologist who discovered Landsommedo, has shown that it was just a ship repair station. And it was founded by Leif Erikson, who, like I said in the show, called it Leif's Budir. Now the sagas themselves describe Vineland as much warmer than Newfoundland, and also as further south. So then we know they have a waypoint, which is Nova Scotia, Landsommedo, which is between Greenland and Vinland. So I would expect Vineland to be much further south, so that it makes sense to have, it can be right next to the waypoint station. So, but if the waypoint station, Leifsbudir, Nova Scotia, and all these other areas in Canada, all the way up to Greenland, if they have those to coast hop, and island hop, then it makes sense that eventually they come to Vinland, which would be the east of current USA. A funny thing, by the way, is that new findings have shown that the Vikings used weed in Newfoundland. Probably other places too. And not just hemp, which obviously was in large use all the way up to, well, the 1900s, but even for recreation. I guess life wasn't too bad, even if it could be cold and wet. Now, the legendary settlement in northeastern USA has to be mentioned, called Norumbega. You can see that in old maps too. And that's the same bird actually as Norway. And that it did indeed appear on many early maps from the 1500s until American colonization. So it's hard to tell if that's identical to Vineland. Maybe that's what rest of Europe referred to as Vineland because they learned of it from the Norsemen. So they would call it Norumbega, the way of the Northerners. So if they went that way, well. And Vinland itself even pops up in written sources, like that of Adam of Bremen's work around 1075. And we mentioned the main penny in the show, and that was from Olav Kyrre's time. That's late thousands. So the Vinlanders were even using money. And all the Norse accounts about our activity there was written down as early as the 1200s. And writing down wasn't the name of the game. Most things were oral back in the day. But thank God they did, so that we have some evidence. Now to the Greenland Mystery. It is one of the great archaeological mysteries, what happened to the Viking colonists in Greenland, because even Iceland was struggling during the Small Ice Age and the Black Plague, but They were in regular touch with the mainland. But the Greenlanders, well, they persevered for over 400 years, from around 1000 to roughly 1450. But then they abandoned their villages and vanished. And it wouldn't have been a mystery if they all came back to Iceland or even Norway. But they lingered on to 1450. By the way, again, what's the big deal to travel there in the 1300s? Actually, as long as there were people in Greenland, there would be knowledge about Vinland. So whatever you think of the Sinclair journals or the Cremona documents, the mere bottom line fact about the Kensington party is not out of character from mainstream history. And yet, they can't even go there. So let's be realistic, but here we have a real mystery, and that's the Greenlanders. At the height, the population was around 4,000. The western settlement and the eastern. The western traded with Inuits. They had more Inuit contact. And that settlement was abandoned as early as around 1350. And the last bishop at Gardar died in 1377. So, for a start, what happened to the western settlement? I mean, if the eastern had survived, maybe we would have known. If the Kensington party and others went down to Vinland, and from the Sinclair journals we see there was a lot of activity, then the most likely thing, if you just use Occam's razor, is that the western Greenlanders went down to join the other people who lived in Vinland. Why didn't they go to Iceland? Well, Iceland was getting icy, as the name suggests, also then. And not even Norway would be a good place to go, because they all emigrated from Norway in the first place. Lack of resources. Second, they probably knew about the Black Plague. So why would they go to Iceland or Norway and risk anything? No, they probably, who knows, maybe one of the ships coming by infected some of them, panic broke loose, and then they went south. That's also a possibility. So it doesn't have to be only the weather, which is what mainstream theorians favor. And we know that I think the latest written sources is a marriage that was recorded in 1408 at the Valsøy fjord between a native Greenlander and an Icelander. But no written records mention the settlers. Carbon dating from the last Norse eastern settlement shows that it was defunct by the late 1400. So that's why we know the Easterners were lingering on. And that coincidences with Colombus going to Iceland, learning about the area, probably then going to Greenland, raiding them, bringing back slaves, and forcing them to admit, there's something called Vinland, getting the resources from the royals, and then embarking upon the expedition. Not knowing, of course, I mean, I don't think he went all the way down to Vinland, as Scott speculated, because then he would know where to go with his main ships. I think he just reckoned, let's go west. He had the ships to do it. He already made sure it wasn't dangerous, got evidence from the Greenlanders, maybe even, who knows, at the time he raided them, there may have been Winelanders visiting too. So then he gets all these armadas rigged and goes straight west, and lands much more further south than where Wineland was. Now, in 1355, King Magnus, who we mentioned in part 2, who is the Magnus that is mentioned in the Sinclair journals, and who was in the West, so it would fit with Sinclair dropping by, he commissioned, like I also mentioned, Paul Knutsson. And they sent ships to Greenland to inspect its western and eastern settlements. Now, the Greenland carrier made the Greenland run at intervals until 1369, when she sank and was not replaced. So, the Kensington party, what's the big deal of them going the same route a mere 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier, whenever it was? But I do agree with the mainstream speculation that part of the reason the Greenlanders vanished was the far-reaching impacts of the Little Ice Age, because intense cold affected the farming. We know that from evidence. Trade with the old world ceased, so the farming collapses, the trade collapses, and prior to 1315 there had been regular ship traffic between Norway, Iceland and Greenland. After 1350, year of the Black Plague exploding, the northern Atlantic became a nightmare of sea ice. So it's like a perfect coalition of tragedy. A Danish archaeologist discovered in 2010 a Norse farm on Igaliku Fjord, excavated a cemetery from the late period of Viking colonization, and found almost no young women. So women of childbearing age had all but vanished. If they had starved, died from illness or been killed in warfare, they'd been in the cemeteries. So where did they go? So it's not just that the people disappeared, but also all childbearing women. Again, could be a combination. Colombus first raiding them and then the survivors fleeing south. One of the Scots examinations of one of the stones, I think one of the spirit point stones, even shows that it even illustrates a map. And it's interesting because it's oriented with east at the top and north to the left, something a forger wouldn't know. Because until the 1500s, medieval maps were identically oriented to place Jerusalem at top. So that's interesting. And there's so many ancient maps that show Vinland. You have the maps identify as Vinilanda Insula and encompasses an area from Maine in the north to the Carolinas in the south, from the Atlantic seaboard to central Pennsylvania. And there's so many maps of Vinland. You have the 1570 Skull-Holt map showing Latinized Norse place names in North America, which again shows that this wasn't just internal stuff among Vikings, but were becoming mainstream in Europe. They, among else, show land of the Risi. I think Risi means giants. The location is unknown. It shows Greenland, it shows Helluland, in other words Baffin Island, Markland, the Labrador Peninsula, land of the Skrelling jar. The location is unknown, but Skrelling is what the Vikings call the natives. And probably they didn't distinguish too much between Amero Indians and Inuits when they used that word. However, later on, and now I'm talking about the first generation's Vikings, but later on the Templars obviously did, and also the Greenlanders, because they became accustomed to the Inuits, both through trade and conflict. And finally it shows the promontory of Vinland, which is the Great Northern Peninsula. So probably the whole American East Coast, and that could also explain why a colony wouldn't survive, even though hundreds and hundreds of people went there between 900s and at least the 1300s. I don't know what the journal says after that, but 1350 probably is the end. So if you have like thousands of people all in all, and then you must account also for children they get, why did the colonies not be there anymore? Well, with such a huge area, it wasn't like one big city. There was many small enclaves. And if they lose contact with the source, it's just inevitable that they end up mingling with the Indians, as even the Sinclair journals account for. They may also, of course, have moved around and encountered hostile tribes, and they would be no match due to the skewed numbers. And remember, these people didn't have advantages of weapons that Colombus brought with him. So they would be at equal footing in terms of war equipment, but severely undermanned in terms of numbers. Now there's a new show out called America's Lost Vikings. I haven't seen it, but I'm going to check it out. Who knows? Maybe for once it can be a decent... Maybe they dare straying so mouse steps outside of the established paradigm. Anything that debunks the Columbus myth, at least, is a good attempt. And there you have it. Thank you for staying with us, and especially thank you to all our donors. You're really keeping us going here. And as ever, I've been your host, Al. Be seeing you.
number one.